Descartes. The guy who basically said, let's throw everything out the window and start over. He's hunting for bedrock certainty. Something so solid even a mischievous demon couldn't shake it. Senses? Nope, too flimsy. Dreams? Hallucinations? Maybe. But then he hits it. I think therefore I am. Even if he's convinced the whole world is an illusion, the very act of being convinced means he exists. A trickster god can't make him vanish while he's still thinking about it. Boom, foundational certainty. So once he's got I exist, Descartes doesn't stop there. He immediately starts cataloging what else he knows for sure about himself. Okay, I exist, but what kind of thing am I? And the answer is a thing that thinks, doubts, understands, wills, imagines, has sensory experiences. Check, 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 check. All part of the package. Interestingly, he also claims certainty about what he seems to perceive. I seem to see light, hear noise. Now he concedes this might be false if he's dreaming, but the seeming itself, the fact that he has this experience of seeing light, is undeniable. It's just another form of thinking. So his initial certainty isn't just I exist, but I exist as a thinking thing with certain mental states, including the seeming of perception. This leads straight into the big question that kept philosophers busy for centuries. How do we get from knowing what our experiences are like, the content, to knowing what causes them, the external world? Is my experience of a red apple caused by an actual red apple out there? Or could it be caused by a cleverly programmed simulation, or maybe a demon just messing with my head? Descartes tackles this head-on. His solution? God. An all-powerful, perfectly good God wouldn't deceive us. Later thinkers tried to finesse this, often making the arguments more complex or less elegant, but Descartes went straight for the divine guarantee. Now when we say I think, therefore I am, it sounds almost trite, right? Like saying the sky is blue. Augustine basically had the same idea. Descartes himself admitted it was pretty obvious. But don't let the simplicity fool you. This seemingly simple statement is the linchpin for his entire philosophical system. It's the foundation for his battle against skepticism, and the starting point for his radical metaphysical conclusions about the mind-body split. The real puzzle, though, is how exactly he arrives at this certainty. That's where things get murky. So why is this cogito such a big deal? First, in epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Descartes wants to build a fortress of knowledge, and the cogito is the first brick, the most unshakable foundation. He's a foundationalist. He believes all knowledge rests on self-evident truths. The cogito provides that initial undeniable foothold. Second, in metaphysics, the study of existence. From this tiny seed of certainty about his own thinking, he tries to grow a massive tree. The conclusion that he is a non-material mind, distinct from his body. How? Because he can be absolutely certain, he thinks, but he can doubt whether he has a body. Since he can doubt the body but not the mind, they must be separate things. It's a classic leap from epistemology to ontology. This theme of using the certainty of the mind against the uncertainty of the body to prove their separation runs through his major works. In The Search for Truth, he lays it out. I don't know if I have a body, I can pretend I don't, but I can't pretend I don't exist. Thinking proves existence. In the Discourse on the Method, he calls himself a substance whose whole essence is simply to think, distinct from any material thing. In the Meditations, thought is the only thing he knows for sure about his essence before bringing God into the picture. And in the Principles, he explicitly says this contrast between knowing you think and not knowing you have a body is the best way to figure out the nature of the mind and its separation from the body. It's a consistent thread. And the impact goes beyond just Descartes' own system. By forcing us to confront this fundamental distinction between the thinking self and the physical world, Descartes throws down a gauntlet for later philosophers. He opens up deep questions about how we conceive of ourselves, how we individuate ourselves from other objects, and what it even means to be a self. His work isn't just a historical artifact, it's a launchpad for ongoing philosophical inquiry. All right, let's try to unpack how Descartes himself understood this initial certainty. The most straightforward interpretation, often called the self-evident intuition/immediate inference interpretation, draws heavily on his earlier work, the Regulae ad directionem ingenii. In these rules he identifies two ways we get to certain knowledge: intuition and deduction. Let's look at what he meant by these. In the rules, Descartes is clear: we only have two reliable paths to knowledge. Deduction is standard logic: if A then B, A is true, therefore B is true. But intuition is different. It's not about wobbly senses or fancy imagination. It's described as a conception so clear and distinct, so self-evident, that doubt is simply impossible. It comes directly from the light of reason. Think of it as a mental spotlight illuminating a truth directly, without needing any intermediate steps. Deduction involves a sequence of thoughts. Intuition is a single, immediate grasp of certainty. So, how does Descartes apply this? He argues we can intuitively grasp basic facts like I exist and a triangle has three sides. Everyone can mentally intuit these, he says. It's presented as a direct, non-inferential act of the mind. He likely extends this intuition to his specific mental states: doubting, willing, imagining. And crucially, he sees the inference from I think to I exist as also being intuitive. It's not a slow logical process. It's a single mental act where you grasp both the premise I think and the conclusion I exist simultaneously. Existence itself is seen as intuitively grasped in this extended sense. Let's clarify this intuition/deduction distinction again. There's primary intuition, grasping a self-evident truth like I think directly, without any prior reasoning. Then there's extended intuition, immediately inferring a conclusion from a primary intuition. When you do this, you don't feel like you're going through a chain of logic. It feels like one single mental leap. So knowing I think is primary intuition. Knowing I exist because you know I think is this extended intuition, still called intuitive because it's immediate, though technically derived. Does Descartes stick to this view elsewhere? Yes, look at his letters. To Newcastle, he says the knowledge of I am thinking, therefore I exist is something your mind sees, feels, and handles. It's intuitive, not reasoned out. Even though imagination tries to muddy the waters, the core knowledge remains intuitive. To Mersenne, he reinforces this. Becoming aware of being a thinking being is a primary notion, not a syllogism. Recognizing I am thinking, therefore I am, is a simple intuition of the mind. He even argues against the syllogism idea. If it were a syllogism, you'd need to know the major premise, everything that thinks exists, beforehand. But we learn that premise from the experience of thinking itself. We realize we can't think without existing. His later works echo this. In the Discourse, he calls the cogito so firm and sure it withstands skeptical attacks, and he accepts it as his first principle. In the Principles, he states it's a contradiction to suppose that what thinks doesn't exist at the time of thinking, making it the first and most certain knowledge. The consistent picture emerging is that Descartes views the entire package, grasping I think, and immediately inferring I exist, as a single intuitive act, the bedrock of his philosophy. Now, Descartes later uses slightly different language, talking about clear and distinct perception instead of intuition. But are they the same thing? The text suggests strongly yes. Both are described as proceeding from the light of reason or the light of nature, and both are tied to clarity and distinctness. So we can reframe the interpretation. All clear and distinct perceptions yield certainty. He clearly and distinctly perceives his own thoughts, e.g., I am thinking. He then clearly and distinctly perceives his existence by immediately deriving it from that perception of thought. As he reflects in the third meditation, in this first item of knowledge there is simply a clear and distinct perception of what I am asserting. This seems to capture the core idea. Okay, so far so good. But hold on, Descartes throws curveballs. Consider this passage from the Principles. He says you must already know the general principle that it is impossible that what thinks should not exist before you can know the cogito. This sounds like he's saying the cogito relies on a hidden premise. I am thinking, and whatever thinks must exist, therefore I exist. But wait, doesn't he explicitly deny this in his replies to critics like Mersenne and Gassendi? He insists it's not a syllogism using that general premise, and that we learn the cogito first, then generalize from it. So, which is it? Is the cogito a simple intuition, Or does it secretly rely on a general principle? There's another tricky passage, this time about how we know substances. Descartes argues we never directly perceive a substance. We only perceive its qualities or attributes. If we see a color, we infer there's something having that color. Applied to himself, this suggests that when he introspects, he only perceives his thoughts, the qualities. His initial awareness is just thought is happening. From there, he'd have to infer. Thought exists, and since everything that exists with qualities must belong to a substance, therefore a thinking substance exists. This sounds like a syllogism, not the immediate, I am thinking therefore I exist, intuition we thought we were capturing. And the structure is different too. Here's a big one. Remember how the initial interpretation claimed clear and distinct perception always guarantees certainty, even against the possibility of a deceptive God? Well, Descartes seems to contradict himself here. In the third meditation, he admits that even simple mathematical truths, perceived clearly enough, become doubtful once he considers the possibility of a deceiving God. He explicitly says God could easily make him wrong even about things he sees, clearly with my mind's eye. Later in his replies, he says an atheist can be clearly aware of geometric truths. But Descartes denies this counts as true knowledge because the atheist is uncertain about deception. Since Descartes himself was initially uncertain about deception, his own clear perceptions shouldn't have been certain either. How can CDP be both sufficient and insufficient for certainty? Finally, look back at the second meditation passage where he declares his certainty. He argues he's certain because no hypothesis can make him nothing, so long as he thinks he is something. He doesn't mention clear and distinct perception or immediate inference here. Instead, he focuses on the logical relationship between potential doubts and the truth of the cogito. If this is the main reason for certainty, what role do those references to CDP and intuition play? And why does he claim certainty about other mental states, like seeming to see light? The deceptive God hypothesis doesn't entail that he seems to see light. It only entails that he thinks he does. The original point of the cogito inference seems lost if it's just about doubts entailing thought/existence. Okay, Descartes seems confused, or at least inconsistent. Should we just throw up our hands? Probably not. Maybe he saw multiple ways to explain his certainty and couldn't quite commit. Let's try to refine our interpretation. We need to account for both the reasonableness of his beliefs and their ultimate certainty. To do this, we need to dig deeper into what Descartes actually meant by certainty and by a reasonable belief. It seems Descartes operates with two levels of epistemic appraisal. At the top, there's certainty, the gold standard. Below that, there's highly probable or very reasonable belief. Think about the first meditation. After doubting the external world, he concedes sensory beliefs are doubtful but still very reasonable. It's much more reasonable to believe than to deny. Plausible principles emerge. Certainties are a subset of very reasonable beliefs. Justification comes from evidence, CDP for self-evident beliefs supporting reasons for others. And crucially, the difference between reasonable and certain is that reasonable beliefs can still have slight reasons for doubt, however weak those reasons might be. What counts as a reason for doubt? It's a possibility Descartes hasn't ruled out, and it shows how a belief might be false despite the evidence. In the first meditation, the dream and deceptive God hypotheses are such reasons for his sensory beliefs. He hasn't ruled them out, he's not certain they're false, and they show how his senses could be misleading. Later, once he achieves certainty about the cogito, he rejects these hypotheses as reasons for doubt. They no longer seem possible to him. The fact that any hypothesis hasn't been ruled out makes his initial doubt seem exaggerated, but also makes it incredibly difficult to dispel. So, armed with this two-tiered view, we can revise our interpretation. Descartes' claim to certainty about the cogito has two parts. First, his beliefs about his thought and existence are very reasonable. Why? Because he clearly and distinctly perceives his thought, I think, and this perception provides the evidence for that belief. He immediately infers existence, I exist, from this, making existence also very reasonable. This is where the CDP/intuition explanation fits. Second, Why are these beliefs so reasonable as to be certain? Because no hypothesis he has yet to rule out serves as a reason for doubt. Why not? Because any potential reason for doubt, like the deceptive God or dream hypothesis, actually entails or presupposes the very things he's trying to doubt, that he thinks and exists. They fail to indicate how his beliefs could be false despite the clear perception. This is where the entailment by doubt's explanation comes in. How do we know no other hypothesis can cast doubt on his thought and existence? Descartes might appeal to some implicit principles. First, no hypothesis can doubt a belief it entails. Second, a hypothesis only indicates doubt if it relates to Descartes himself, meaning it must entail the proposition "I exist." Third, a hypothesis only indicates doubt if it explains how his intellectual faculties are failing, meaning it must entail the proposition "I think." Put these together, any hypothesis that casts doubt must entail both "I exist" and "I think," due to 2 and 3, but cannot entail them, due to 1, contradiction. Therefore, no hypothesis can serve as a reason for doubt for his beliefs about thought and existence. But what about doubts concerning the content of his mental states, like seeming to see light? Couldn't a deceptive God make him seem to see light when there's none? Descartes needs an answer here too. Perhaps a fourth principle applies. A hypothesis only indicates doubt about a contingent belief if it's possible for Descartes to have that belief, while the hypothesis is true and the belief is false. For beliefs about his own mental states, Descartes might argue it's impossible for him to be mistaken. To believe he seems to see red is partly to actually seem to see red. To believe he's in pain is partly to actually be in pain. These beliefs are incorrigible for him. No hypothesis can satisfy the condition of showing how he could have the belief and be wrong. So how does this modified interpretation handle the problems? First, the issue of CDP and the deceptive God solved. Clear and distinct perception makes beliefs very reasonable, but certainty requires resisting doubt, which the cogito beliefs achieve because doubts entail them. Second, the problem of doubts entailing the cogito solved. Both aspects of the explanation are now essential. Third, the confusing passage in the principles about the general principle solved. The general principle isn't part of the inference itself, but background knowledge needed to understand why doubts entail the cogito. It just needs to be reasonable, not certain for Descartes at this point. Fourth, the substance awareness problem solved. Those passages are likely about inferring substancehood for any object, including the self, from qualities, not about the initial cogito inference itself. This is consistent with the modified view. Okay, so our interpretation seems to navigate the textual maze better. But does it solve the underlying philosophical problems? Not entirely. Even if we accept the logic of transferring reasonableness via intuition/inference to certainty via resistance to doubt, the biggest question remains. How does he get the initial very reasonable belief that he thinks? His appeal to clear and distinct perception feels vague. What exactly is this mental vision? Why does it make a belief very reasonable? And why does he use it for both knowing contingent facts about his mind and necessary truths like geometry? Knowing a sphere is bounded by a single surface feels like grasping a definition or relation, but knowing "I think" feels different. Cutting out CDP doesn't help either. It leaves us with only the entailment by doubt's part, which feels incomplete as an explanation of certainty. So, we've journeyed through Descartes' cogito, wrestled with the initial interpretation, faced the textual challenges, and arrived at a more nuanced modified view. This helps us appreciate how Descartes might have intended to explain both the reasonableness and the certainty of his foundational insight. Yet, the deepest waters remain, the very nature of clear and distinct perception, and how it supposedly grants us access to our own minds. That's a puzzle for another day.